Don't listen to what anyone else tells you. Podcasting is not easy. Sure, it's fun and accessible, but if you hold yourself to a high standard of fact-checking and have integrity in your reporting, it's a bit of a beast, but it's worth it. We give you our very best because you deserve it. Would you meet us halfway? Please make a donation. Visit kcur.org/support.
Wow. How long is that bridge, I wonder?
I would guess it's pretty close to a mile long. It used to be the longest and tallest bridge in the state when it was built.
It can feel kind of surreal right now because it's like, why is there like a mile of bridge over just dirt?
All right, Celia. So where are we? I mean, mudflats?
Several thousand acres of mudflats.
Wow. Okay, so this bridge only makes sense if you know that there used to be a lake under it.
There was a nice gravelly beach, boats that would pull up on the beach, and water skiers.
And so this lake, did it just dry up?
Nope. Did you ever water ski?
A lot.
So I'd be hard-pressed to find a better guide to drive me around the area than this guy, Brian McNulty.
We camped holiday weekends.
He grew up nearby,
playing in the lake.
Spent a lot of time fishing with his grandpa.
He liked to set either trot lines or bank lines.
And this was in the 70s. So Brian knows this place like the back of his hand because it's his childhood stomping grounds, but also because of his specific job at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
I'm the operations project manager at Tuttle Creek Lake.
Tuttle Lake in eastern Kansas. Okay, so I know where we are now. This is a huge reservoir problem, not just in Kansas, but all over the place. These lakes are effectively vanishing.
Right. And what we're talking about today is not because the water's going away. It's that they're filling up with mud that takes up all the space. The water below that bridge was more than 30 feet deep. Now it's more than 30-foot deep sediment. He showed me all these spots that used to be lakeside. They're really far from what's left of the lake now. There's some picnic tables left.
Yeah, a few picnic tables and a few concrete shelters. But I remember coming in here on a 4th of July weekend, and it was wall-to-wall tents and campers and hundreds of boats.
The old marina totally filled in. Brian showed me a boat ramp just barely sticking out above the mudflat.
Buried under several feet of sediment.
So half of Tuttle Lake is gone.
Half the lake?
I've got some clarifying to do about that stat later, but just pin it for now.
Just for folks who don't know, this is not just a lake for camping and for fun. This is the water supply for this area. That's what's on the line here.
Yep.
And especially in dry years, Kansas really needs this lake.
Specifically northeast Kansas. And for listeners, even if you don't live here, there's still a good chance that there's a reservoir near you also silting in. So to picture the sheer volume of sediment pouring into Tuttle and eating up our water storage, one of the Army Corps engineers told me to picture 3.5 football fields and then pile them with earth as tall as the Empire State Building.
That's how much has washed into Tuttle?
No, that is how much earth has washed into Tuttle each year since we put up a dam here and made this into a lake in the early 60s. A small lake, maybe you could just haul the mud away?
Just imagine doing that at a lake this huge.
And the hundreds of thousands of truckloads of material that would have to be excavated. The expense of just scooping that up and driving it somewhere is enormous. And then what do you do with all of it? You could bury the entire K-State campus with the volume of material that is stored in what used to be the normal part of the lake.
Man, so is there at least some kind of plan, or are we just going to run out of water?
Well, it's a good thing you're listening to this podcast episode to find out.
From the Kansas News Service and KCUR studios, you're listening to Up From Dust, a podcast about the environmental price of trying to shape the world around us.
And the folks who are rolling up their sleeves to find less damaging, more sustainable ways to fix our generational mistakes. I'm Celia Yopis-Jepsen.
And I'm David Kondos. Across the Midwest and beyond, mind-boggling amounts of earth are eroding off our landscapes and washing into our reservoirs.
We are up against a tricky reality. Humans have made erosion so much worse in so many places, with effects for habitat.
And for ourselves. These shrinking lakes are beloved places for camping and fishing. More critically, many, like Tuttle, are an insurance policy against years when the rains don't come.
So, at this Kansas lake, engineers plan to test a whole new way to tackle the infamous mud conundrum. No one knows yet if it'll work, because it will be a world first.
All right, so give us some quick facts on Tuttle Creek Lake.
Actually, let me start with the Kansas River.
Okay.
More than 800,000 people depend on it for drinking water.
Yeah, and that's some of this state's biggest cities, like Topeka, Lawrence, Olathe.
The river also fuels our economy and cities in other ways, like there are 3 coal-fired power plants that need the Kansas River for cooling water. So, in drought years, like 2023, when the river would run too low for all these needs, reservoirs save the day. And these dams, including Tuttle, are on the Kansas River's tributaries.
So the Army Corps of Engineers can increase the river flow as needed.
Exactly. We also use reservoirs for lots of other things, of course, protecting us from floods or making sure there's enough water for barges in dry years. Like the Kansas River empties into the Missouri River. So Tuttle is actually one of a whole bunch of reservoirs in several states that help make sure the Missouri stays deep enough for that traffic. We also use reservoirs to deal with water pollution. This is a really sad fact, but a lot of chemicals wash into our rivers. Farm fertilizer, lawn fertilizer, all these things. And when the river level drops...
So that stuff just gets more concentrated.
It does. So keeping up the volume in the Kansas River dilutes it. Literally, reservoirs like Tuttle are used to make sure that drinking water sources like the Kansas River meet the federal Clean Water Act.
Wow.
Okay, so that's a bit about reservoirs and Tuttle in particular. But David, before we talk about our chances of fixing the situation, I mean, the fact that Tuttle is vanishing, we're going to look erosion in the eye. We'll swing by one rural setting and one urban one to see 2 very different ways that human activity makes really erosion-prone landscapes and what people are doing about it. So, David, imagine you're a farmer.
All right.
You plant your corn right up to the riverbank. Later in the season, a bunch of your corn is gone. To be more specific, the land itself is gone.
Because you can see you can kind of follow the corn row, and all of a sudden that corn row just disappears over the bank because the bank eroded that much.
Within a single season.
Yeah,
they planted it with corn and now it's already gone.
Yep, exactly.
This river's literally gobbling up their cropland.
Yeah. So this is Andy Klein with the Kansas Forest Service. He works with landowners, a lot of farmers, on projects to protect riverbanks that are crumbling really fast.
One farmer nearby told me, he said, I wish we could have done this project 15 years ago because I've lost about 15 acres of cropland here.
Wow.
15 acres of his farm? That's just mind-boggling.
So, not surprisingly, the state government is worried. The Kansas Water Office has a bunch of ways that it's trying to address this. And one is it uses aerial images to find erosion hotspots.
Because these sites show up very clearly, and you can see, this site, the bank has eroded 30 feet from 2015 to 2020.
Then they know to talk to those landowners and see if they're willing to make some changes.
Most landowners are pretty receptive, but some don't want to participate, so we just have to skip over them.
So I met up with Andy on a farm
just south of Marysville, Kansas.
It was close to the Kansas-Nebraska border.
Along the Big Blue River.
One of the rivers that feeds into Tuttle Lake. And the erosion there was...
way too fast, way faster than normal. Then as the banks erode away, all that soil ends up in the river and is carried down to Tuttle Reservoir.
Andy and his crew want to deal with this problem preferably in as natural a way as possible.
So he's like a riverbank superhero swooping in.
Swooping in to help protect the riverbanks. He is. So the crops here were previously growing all the way up to the river, but not anymore. I watched them planting a buffer zone of thick vegetation.
Switchgrass seeded here.
The more kinds, the merrier.
Western wheatgrass.
Because variety brings all sorts of benefits.
Cottonwood and sycamore.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So nice, deep roots, and that kind of anchors the soil in place, right?
It does. Measuring from the water's edge, you'd now have to cross more than 70 feet of native grasses and wildflowers and trees before reaching that farmer's first row of crops. But I will say these projects aren't simple or cheap, or else I'm sure we could do them all over and get them done a lot faster. You're dealing with riverbanks that have effectively become cliffs because of all of the erosion. So you have to bring in machines and a crew, and they regrade the riverbank into a slope before they can get to that planting. And that planting is the part that's near and dear to Andy's heart. He and other people gather seeds in parks, cemeteries, wherever to help keep down the costs of restoring vegetation along streams. Then he brings all these seeds to farms.
The acorns, the walnuts, pecans.
Thousands and thousands of tree nuts, and uses a special planter.
It's pulled by a small tractor. The idea is to plant it thick and heavy.
Because only a tiny sliver will ever become trees.
All right, keep going.
Andy has resigned himself to this fact.
Turkeys will come in and eat some, deer will eat some, squirrels, but actually mice are the bigger predator. There's even an old Chip and Dale and Donald Duck Disney short where Donald Duck is a U.S. Forest Service ranger. And he's out there planting acorns, and of course Chip and Dale are out there picking them up. Some critters will probably move in tonight and start eating.
Time for an urban example. Let's go to McConnell Air Force Base.
All right. Wichita, the biggest city in Kansas.
Everyone's putting on their waders now.
So I waded into McConnell Creek with some folks who taught me two really important things: how built environments can cause erosion, and that creeks like this one would be totally unrecognizable to people who saw them 100 or 200 years ago.
So this original little stream would have been only 6 inches deep.
Time was, you could probably just kneel next to this creek and dip your hand into the water. But now it's a steep 10-foot drop down to the water.
10-foot vertical sand is not ideal.
And it just keeps eroding. This is Samantha Ginsburg, at the time an intern for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with Charlie Barden, a natural resources professor from Kansas State University, now retired.
You can tell at the top where you can see all the grass roots hanging down. That's because the new flood has washed all the soil out of those roots.
Yeah, we're just seeing all these roots sort of hanging and dangling in the wind.
Yes.
Right? How did it get this way?
The Air Force Base, the buildings, the runway, all that sheds water much more quickly.
Let me explain. So once upon a time, imagine this was a prairie. That little brook meandering through just a few inches deep.
Mm-hmm.
Storms would roll in. The prairie, with all its thick vegetation, would absorb the rain right where it fell. Like the rain would percolate into the healthy soil because healthy ground does that. Then the water would kind of drain slowly underground through that soil over toward the little brook. So after a storm, you'd see a little waterway like that swell really slowly for a few days, but, no big deal.
It would come slower, be more like water oozing out of a sponge instead of running off a countertop and flooding.
You think about our cities, a lot of it is like a countertop. I mean,
Yeah.
everything's hard, smooth surface, can't absorb water. We're talking streets, roofs, sidewalks.
Even grass lawns, they're actually pretty awful at absorbing rain too. So McConnell Creek runs through a city and an Air Force base, and the results are dramatic. Rainwater runs fast and furious to this creek. It carves out the creek bed. The bottom sinks deeper and deeper. The sides grow wider and wider apart.
But yeah, these banks have probably lost maybe a couple of feet in the spring because it's been so much heavy rain.
You mean that they moved a few feet back?
Yeah.
So now when I see creeks and streams that are several feet below the surrounding ground, I look at them differently because often it is erosion that's happening too fast. And that soil is totally washing downstream into a reservoir.
And also, just to drop in a quick side note here, this isn't just an erosion issue. I mean, having all that stormwater moving so fast off city landscapes also contributes to flooding, like flooding in the streets and water pollution.
It does. Also, the erosion is not great for wildlife and habitat in the creeks and streams. But Charlie and his students have been trying this trick that involves chopping down trees and repurposing them.
Wait, chopping down trees?
Sorry, this is no loss. These are eastern red cedars that have gone rogue.
All right. Well, then I don't care. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So here these trees are growing near the creek and they want to get rid of them anyway.
Uh-huh. And so for listeners who want some context on that, check out our episode called The Green Glacier. This particular tree species is its own whole can of worms on the Great Plains.
Hey!
So they heave red cedars into the creek, lay them along the bank, and anchor them there. The idea is to kind of slow the creek flow there, shield the bank.
The cedar tree acts like a little mini coral reef, and it allows vegetation, algae to kind of get stuck on it and grow, and then the little critters come and graze on the algae, and the bigger macroinvertebrates come and eat the algae grazes.
Wow, kind of kickstarting this whole little ecosystem.
There's something crawling on your hand. What is that?
Related to shrimp.
Yeah, these ones are like shrimp. They're small to us, but very significant to environment.
So grad students Jorge Serrano and Mariah DeRay were there.
Just a tiny little movement.
They were catching critters the size of ants.
I guess I kind of feel like a giant holding them in my hand and feeling them.
In eroded places in the creek, they find very few of these, but the little critters bounced back fast after this stream bank project started.
Yes, many more shrimp.
Daryline Daisy, also a grad student at the time, was there helping.
Invertebrate animals do get overlooked a lot.
Why do you care?
Oh, why do I care? Being able to be in a stream system that you actually rejuvenated yourself is a great feeling. Animals do have, their own life as well. They're also as important as for us.
Okay, so this is the type of thing that's going to save our reservoirs and put an end to erosion.
Well, actually, no.
Wait, what? What? I mean, what are we doing here, Celia? You're getting my hopes up.
I'm sorry. I feel like I've just played a trick on you or something. No, here's the thing, David. This is the complexity. We do need to restore healthy riverside habitats.
Mm-hmm.
We need to incorporate rain gardens and great vegetation into our cities. We need to farm differently so that our soil is healthier again and can soak up rain the way prairies used to. All those things are critical, but there's more to this story, David, and I have a bone to pick with the laws of physics.
It's a great time of year to kick back with a movie and enjoy the ultimate cinema snack, popcorn.
If a building didn't smell like popcorn and I went in to watch a movie, I'm questioning where I'm at.
There is the sensory overload of walking in and smelling fresh popcorn.
But did you know that it was a Kansas City woman who helped popularize the pear? Hear the whole story on KCUR's podcast, A People's History of Kansas City.
Brace yourself for some bad news, David. Ultimately, all of our reservoirs are destined to fill up with silt, sand, clay, etc. All that stuff I've been calling mud for simplicity's sake.
Man, really? I mean, I gotta say, this does not sound like a great long-term plan.
Well, we're kind of up against the laws of physics here.
At some point, every hole is filled with dirt.
Think of our dammed up lakes as really just like holes that we've created.
Basically, a reservoir is a hole with water in it that fills in with sediment. Eventually, it will fill in.
Oddmane Husic is an engineering professor at Virginia Tech with an expertise in all things water. So I talked to him about this. Erosion is a literal law of the land. Here's the way it works. There have always been places on the landscape where soil washes away. Also, places where it moves too. And there are advantages to this. This is not all bad news. Over time, a mountainside erodes, but downstream, a new sandbar forms. Floodplains become more fertile. Silt builds up coastal wetlands. Tons of great stuff comes out of erosion.
And there's kind of a balance. There's a natural balance that the sediment cycle would achieve without humans. But when humans get involved, we cause a lot more soil to enter rivers.
And this sped up erosion has a bunch of implications, really. But today we're talking about the reservoir problems, of course. So here's another very pesky law of physics that we're dealing with. When a river is whisking a bunch of soil away and then it slows down, it drops that soil.
Oh, so when we dam the river, we're essentially creating this mud trap.
Mm-hmm.
Like at Tuttle, where you started this episode.
Bingo. There are thousands of acres of mudflats where the rivers enter Tuttle Lake.
All that sand and silt drops.
Exactly. And then year by year, those mudflats spread south and gobble up more of the lake.
Okay. And so remind me, you said half the lake is now gone?
Yeah. And by the end of this century, about 85% of it will be gone. But David, this is where we need to have a brief nerd out moment about reservoirs so I can explain that statistic.
I knew some kind of nerd out moment had to be coming here somewhere.
Nerd out? Okay, so I'm talking about half of the multi-purpose pool.
And what does that mean?
So imagine you are building a dam.
Okay.
You put a wall basically on a river, right? And flood a valley, create a lake. A certain amount of lake that you've decided you want. That is your multi-purpose pool. You're happy now because you've got a lake. It's going to be your water for drought years and stuff. People are going to go fishing and boating and all that jazz. But actually, of course, you build that dam taller than you're going to need for that lake.
Right, because you want to leave a little extra space for floodwater.
Yeah, in the case of Tuttle, a whole lot of extra space. Normally, Tuttle is a 17 square mile lake or so. Maximum Tuttle in all its full floodwater holding glory, it can swell to an 85 square mile lake when we need it to.
Oh, wow.
So the only reason I'm telling you all this is to clarify that the floodwater volume at Tuttle is not the main worry right now. When I say half of Tuttle is gone, I mean half of the multi-purpose pool.
Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that the floodwater capacity at Tuttle is doing well because goodness knows there are times when we need that and then it needs to protect us from floods.
Like 2019.
But that multi-purpose pool, I mean, we need that for drinking water for hundreds of thousands of Kansans in drought years. So what's the plan to save that?
Right. Well, unfortunately, this is a worldwide problem with no single answer. You can remove a dam to get sediment flowing again out of it, to clear it out. But then you're removing the dam, so that also means giving up the water storage.
Okay. And then I know you talked about dredging. Is it ever an option?
Sometimes that happens. Kansas and the Corps of Engineers actually did that at a different lake in Kansas nearly a decade ago called Redmond. And bit of context, Redmond Lake is a backup source of cooling water for a nuclear power plant. So that's why it's really important, right?
I remember hearing about that one. Yeah.
It cost $20 million to do dredging there. They cleared out about 3 years worth of mud. But let's stop for a second and compare that to Tuttle. Tuttle is much bigger. The mud that settles into Redmond over the course of 3 years, Tuttle takes that in every 4 months. So, I don't know, imagine spending $20 million every 4 months trying to haul mud out of Tuttle.
Wow. Okay. So that's a lot of money.
Also, try to picture the amount of fossil fuel it would take to haul that much mud away, right? That would be bonkers. And then, like Brian from the Army Corps said earlier,
you could bury the entire K-State campus with the volume of material that is stored in what used to be the normal part of the lake.
Yeah, and then you'd have to keep doing it because the very next year, another, 3.5 football fields of soil as tall as the Empire State Building will show up again.
Yes. Right. So next year, 2025, the Kansas Water Office and the Corps of Engineers are partnering to try a new approach at Tuttle. No one has ever done this to clear mud out of a reservoir.
So this is the first time ever in the whole world?
Yes.
Lay it on me.
Okay. So their big idea is basically to create an underwater mudslide.
Yeah, you can kind of imagine it as sort of like an avalanche.
So the physics, admittedly, are a little different. But Admin says, mudslide or avalanche, that's a nice layman's way to picture this. Scientists like him are definitely watching this pilot with interest.
So is this exciting that they're trying something that no one's ever tried on a reservoir? Would other states with similar issues or other countries with similar issues be watching this to see if it works?
I think so. And I think if Kansas were to prove this as a successful concept, I think it would be a big jump forward.
All right, let's picture the lake underwater.
Okay.
The lake bed is sloped. They want to move mud downhill underwater to the exit gates on the dam. Now, what's cool about Tuttle is that the gates where the water comes out are at the bottom of the dam wall, which isn't the case for all dams.
But how do they move this mud kind of downhill toward that exit?
Well, they are going to use water jets. I know this is silly, but I keep picturing like the jets of water that squirt out of a jacuzzi. So like water jets.
Okay.
So anyway, the idea is to aim gentle water jets at the lake bed. And in theory, you're pelting it, the sludge starts swirling around, and then it creates a layer on the bottom of the lake of water that is weighed down with silt.
There's a density difference.
And then gravity does its thing.
So all of that stuff is going to want to move downhill. That's the idea.
All right. So you've got your jacuzzis, your jets, and okay, this sounds cool.
But here's the thing. No one knows if it'll work. Engineers have used this water jet concept to move mud in other places, but only in places where the body of water already moves. Like a coastal marina where there are ocean tides to help whisk the mud away after you loosen it.
Okay.
So it might not work when you're just talking about the bottom of a stationary lake. Maybe the silt in Tuttle will just swirl up a bit, but not actually move downhill.
And then it just settles back in the exact same location. None of that makes it to the outlet.
But maybe it'll work. I mean, it can't restore Tuttle to the size it once was, but maybe it'll turn out this is something we can use long-term to release quite a bit of silt and significantly extend how many years of life we can squeeze out of Tuttle.
But as you're describing this, I have kind of a dumb question.
Okay.
So like you said water jets. What does that look like? Like, are they bringing in air from the surface and they're pointing them at the bottom?
No. Well, yeah. Okay. Yeah, kind of. Like, I think what they're going to do is if you imagine like you take a boat or barge onto the lake with these jets underneath them, and they're not going to shoot air. They're just going to move water around. That's why I keep picturing a jacuzzi swirling water around.
Oh, right. I wasn't sure how to picture it, but I think that helps. So if this works, then this approach could get used at other dams.
That's part of the point of doing a pilot project is maybe it won't just help Tuttle, it might help other places. But when I ask, how many dams could benefit from this, there's no answer right now. And the reason is that reservoirs are actually, it turns out, all really different. So if this pilot project works, then the next thing they'd have to do is consider a whole bunch of factors for every reservoir, like the angle of the slope of the lake bed, where the dam gates are, all sorts of things.
Okay. And so then my other question is, what are the downsides if they know yet? I mean, if this works at Tuttle, the mud flows downstream. I'm guessing that might cause some problems too?
Good question. It might. Now let's shift our focus from the lake itself to the river downstream and unpack those potential negative and actually also potential positive effects.
All right. Negatives first.
Okay. One, a lot of chemicals wash off of farm fields and into Tuttle, especially, as we mentioned, fertilizers, weed killers, in particular atrazine.
Okay, but that stuff has to already be in the Kansas River.
I can tell that you've covered environment for a while. Yes.
I've heard of those before. Yeah.
Unfortunately, there is already pollution in the Kansas River, but it is also true that Tuttle is holding some of that stuff back because these substances sink to the bottom of the lake. That's actually another way that the lake benefits water quality downstream. But this water jet idea could also release some of that pollution downstream. 2, the water utilities that pull drinking water from the Kansas River might have to treat it more during the pilot project.
Sure.
Now, I've talked to a few of the cities downstream, and they're prepared and they're cool with it because they really want Tuttle Lake not to disappear. 3, releasing mud could make oxygen levels drop in the river during that pilot project. Now, I'm not going to get into the chemistry behind why that is, but obviously oxygen is important for fish. So considering all these things I just mentioned, all the environmental groups and scientists at our universities in the region and such, they're asking the Corps of Engineers, hey, take this seriously, monitor the heck out of the river. And you can read how the Corps is going to handle monitoring and all those details in this huge 300-page document that lays out the whole proposal. And the plan is to run the water jet pilot project, which has this really wonkish name, water injection dredging, for short periods. For example, maybe 20 hours a day for 5 days, and do that in the spring of 2025, and then again in the summer, and again in the fall.
Mm-hmm.
And each time monitor downstream at 10 sites to see, is there any change to the oxygen level, heavy metals in the water, fertilizer, pesticide? And if these sites detect something downstream, like let's just say there's a rise in phosphorus when they release silt, then the Corps of Engineers would turn off the water jets or also let a bunch more water out of Tuttle to dilute the phosphorus. And they do not think it will come to that based on testing the composition of the mud in the lake. But anyway, that's the plan.
All right.
Okay, moving on to the surprising possible positives.
Let's hear it.
Okay. It turns out people are actually really curious to see if all this mud might be a good thing for the Kansas River. Let me introduce you to Keith Gitto, a biology professor at K-State.
Why do you study fish? What's so cool about fish?
Oh, man. What's not cool about fish? I mean, come on. They're awesome.
I do not know much about fish, but when I talked to Keith, I felt like I got him because I realized he talks about fish kind of the way I talk about birds.
Everybody loves fish, don't they? Blue sucker, the short-headed red horse.
So I'm starting to think of fish as like underwater goldfinches.
Like the fish around here, if you go out in the springtime when they're all colored up, a lot of times they just get beautiful colorations.
All right.
So the Corps of Engineers contracted Keith to scrutinize what effect this pilot project has on river life downstream.
The fish communities, the macroinvertebrates, the bug communities.
If it turns out that we can flush some sediment out of Tuttle and it doesn't hurt the river habitat and animals downstream, Keith will consider that a win.
Because the lake is vital for water supplies?
Exactly. But like a better scenario would be if releasing mud helps the river. Because it turns out lots of fish love mud and we've been depriving them.
Right, okay, because those fish maybe evolved in a river that looks pretty different than the dammed up system that's there today.
You've probably heard this before. Dams are super disruptive to river wildlife.
If you're a free-flowing river, you put a dam on it, that's about the worst thing you could do for the river ecosystem, right?
I've heard about the salmon in coastal states and Colorado River. There's examples all over the place.
That's a really high-profile example. Dams physically block fish from moving through. That's one disruption, but blocking mud is actually another. Some animals need pulses of muddy water from rainstorms in the spring and summer.
The plains minnow is an example of a species that has really declined in the Kansas River.
plains minnows evolved to spawn during those pulses.
Eggs, the fertilized eggs then kind of drift down the river. Not all the other fish are gobbling up the eggs.
Probably because, the murkiness makes it hard for predators to see them. In recent decades, fish that thrive in clear water are actually winning out. Sunfish, bass, these species are expanding a lot, probably even invasive carp.
Okay, so Tuttle is blocking some of this kind of seasonal muddiness that you described, and maybe releasing some of that mud downstream is a good thing.
It might tip the balance for these other native species. It might give them a little bit of an advantage.
Last thing for today. We've been talking to government agencies and academics. Now we'll hear from an environmental group. There was a point last century when the government was like, let's put huge dams all over the place for water control and hydroelectric power. But these kinds of projects earned federal engineers basically a reputation for wrecking rivers. And environmentalists have been pretty skeptical of them since then. So honestly, I was kind of expecting to find that conservation groups were opposed to engineers pelting the bottom of Tuttle and flushing silt downstream because, the possible downsides that we already discussed. But I talked to a few of the groups that are watching the project closely, and they're actually very curious to see what comes of this pilot project.
There is a need for this project.
Heidi Mell with the Nature Conservancy. She can give us a few reasons. She studies sediment and river habitat, and she has a great title.
Fluvial geomorphologist.
Fluvial geomorphologist. Okay.
So fluvial, what does that mean? River? Or...
Yeah, flowing water.
The Nature Conservancy has been worried for a long time about how reservoirs disrupt river wildlife and what we could do to maybe make them less awful for wildlife.
Yes, the Nature Conservancy is absolutely interested in restoring that, the environs of the rivers as much as possible.
The Nature Conservancy has worked with the Corps of Engineers for a few decades now on this thing called the Sustainable Rivers Program. And the idea is kind of like, okay, given the reality of these dams, can we find a way to make the situation better for animals? And it turns out sometimes we can't. For example, when we release water, mussels crawl up the riverbanks
to feed as the water level goes up.
And then if we close the dam's gates too suddenly and the water drops too fast,
they don't have time to follow the receding water back into the channel. And so they get left stranded and many of them die.
So we can release water in a way that mimics nature better to avoid killing mussels. This is the kind of stuff that this sustainable river concept is about.
And releasing the mud would potentially be another one of these ways to kind of mimic how nature worked before us?
Well, the Nature Conservancy figures maybe if we're smart enough about when we release mud, how much, what time of year, maybe this can benefit river habitat. Now, it won't be a magic fix for the problems that dams create. No one is saying that. For example, what engineers will potentially let out of Tuttle is silt, fine mud. There's all this other trapped stuff in Tuttle, sand, gravel, heavier things that we don't have a good way to move.
Okay.
Ideally, some of that stuff would move downstream too. Gravel's good for fish that nest in it. Sand replenishes sandbars for migrating shorebirds. But at least releasing silt, if we don't find negative side effects in the river, is something. And conservation groups agree with the Corps that we should try to squeeze as many years as we can out of Tuttle because it already exists. And in this region, we don't have a lot of options for water. Some places in the U.S. are removing dams where possible to restore unobstructed river flow, but Northeast Kansas is super dependent on lakes like Tuttle in dry years. And one day when Tuttle and other critical reservoirs become too full of mud,
we're likely going to see proposals for new dams and new reservoirs, which would mean new valleys flooded, lands and towns lost.
Oh, wow.
So that would mean more river habitat disruption and moving towns out of the way. 8 towns were once in the valley that became Tuttle Creek Lake.
I think we have very limited options for recovering reservoir storage. And I think this has potential, but the focus can't be 100% on reservoir storage recovery. It has to be reservoir storage recovery and downstream ecology in the river. The river, not only supports incredible biology, it also supports 800,000 people's drinking water supply.
Up From Dust is a production of the Kansas News Service, aka the NPR stations of Kansas, and of KCUR Studios. We reported it over the past 2 years. This episode is reported and written by me. This is the moment where I wish David Condos continued success. We couldn't keep him on this podcast forever. He's got work cut out for him covering the environment at KUER in Utah. But David will never forget Kansas. Don't tell me you miss getting caught in dust storms, though.
I do. In like a weird way, yeah, because it's just like this raw, power, out of your control.
Thanks for all your reporting, David. Mackenzie Martin is our senior producer. Huge thanks this episode to Suzanne Hogan, Gabe Rosenberg, Stephen Caranda, Genevieve Desmarteau, Celia Morton, and Olivia Hewitt. The fabulous Jessica Corneliuson made our podcast logo. Mark Robbins of the University of Kansas again let us use his amazing bird recordings in the Macaulay Library at Cornell. Thank you, Mark. Music provided by David Condos, Tom Lonnie, Milktooth, and Blue Dot Sessions. Okay, guys, we originally planned to do 6 episodes of Up From Dust. That's it. But the response we've gotten from you has been so great that we are going to continue. So if you haven't yet, please subscribe to our feed. We cannot wait to bring you more stories. Also, we're way grateful if you can share Up From Dust with others or leave us a review. It truly helps. Thanks for listening.
Scientist Kara Akabach is obsessed with the cold.
I jumped in the freezing cold lake the other day twice. I am just built for that.
She spends a lot of time in subarctic Finland studying reindeer herders. And there's a deeper purpose to her fascination with frigid temperatures.
We'll see extreme cold snaps in places that have never seen it before.
I'm Kate the Chemist. Find out what Kara has learned about adapting to the cold on my podcast, Seeking a Scientist, made possible by the Stowers Institute.